Dr. Luis Urrieta Jr. Is the Susan B. And John L. Adams Professor of Education in the Cultural Studies and Education program at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also an affiliated faculty member with UT Austin Center for Mexican American Studies, the Native American and Indigenous Studies program, and the Lozano Long Benson Institute of Latin American Studies. Dr. Urrieta has been the recipient of numerous prestigious fellowships and awards, and is the author of numerous research articles, book chapters, and books. His research centers on Chicanx, Latinx, and Indigenous, Purepecha cultures and identities, activism as a social practice in educational spaces, in oral and narrative traditions in qualitative research, and indigenous knowledge systems and research methodologies. His current research and book on the activism of indigenous mothers is based on extensive ethnographic data collected between 2006 and 2014, including a year's stay in Nocutzepo, Mexico, between 2009 and 2010, in which he conducted over 200 unstructured and semi-structured ethnographic interviews with community members and oral history interviews with elders. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Luis Urrieta, Jr.
Well, good morning. Well, good afternoon, right? I'm very happy to be here with all of you today, and I was joking with Eric earlier, and I was telling him I hope that they can see more than my head behind the podium. But as long as you can hear me, I think that's fine, right? So the title of my talk today is Resurgent Indigeneity, Remaking Indigena and Community Through Education. I want to start off with a little I'm going to read something that tells you a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about today. Despite decades of research and increasing theoretical sophistication about identity as socially constructed, social scientists still sometimes take for granted that some people are indigenous and some aren't. In this talk, I challenge that view by focusing on a group of mothers in the pueblo of San Miguel Nocutzepo in Michoacán, Mexico, that are actively remaking their position on the contested and ambiguous borders between Purepecha and Mestiza. What it means to be indigenous in one region and even within a pueblo like Nocutzepo means something different in another, especially because Indio is often not only associated with race and/or ethnicity, but with land tenure, notions of backwardness, lack of modernist progress, and/or simply rurality. While in some communities there is no question that people perceive themselves and are perceived to be indigenous, in others like Nocutzepo, teasing through indigeneity is not as easy. In this talk, I open up the questions of what it means for people to claim, reject, and most importantly, simultaneously both summon and erase an indigenous identity, as Saldaña Portillo argues in her book, Indian Given. In order to explore the muddy waters of the contradictions and complexities of mestizaje and indigeneity, I draw from ethnographic data on a group of women who mobilized to improve education in their community and to untangle how they reclaimed an indigenous identity, even though they belong to what some would consider a de-Indianized pueblo. I will argue that the mother's reclaimed Indigena identity is not only a largely woman-led response to generational educational neglect on the part of the school system, but also to a call to collective action for viable futures in the face of dwindling economic opportunities, precisely due to political economic restructuring and regional recomposition in the post-NAFTA era. So before I do that, I want to do a little disclosure. As Eric said, my family comes from this community. I was not born there. I was born in Los Angeles. But I grew up around a lot of people from this community, so I grew up having a strong sense of family, a strong sense of community, comunidad, and a strong sense of convivencia, because whenever we had any kind of celebration, it was usually people from the same town that would gather. I also grew up traveling back and forth to Mexico, to the community, and spending time there, usually during the summers. As an adult, I started doing research there in 2006, studying the experiences of children born in the US, of parents from the community, and what their learning experiences were like back in the community. And then in 2009, 2010, I spent a year there, as Dr. Baibi mentioned, conducting the work for this study, this book, that I will be presenting today. So it was mostly ethnographic work. It also involved some archival work, which I learned to do as a consequence of doing this work and trying to put it into a larger historical context. And I've been doing ethnographic visits ever since then. I mentioned that I'm an insider and an outsider at the same time, because even though I'm part of the community, I also was not born in the community. And so there's always that tension between whether you're fully accepted as a member of the community, and that my experience as a US-born person, as an academic, as a researcher, also influences my position and the power dynamics involved in this work. Also, that a lot of my work was done with women, largely, and so to negotiate that, especially during interviews, one-on-one interviews, was a very delicate issue in the community. And so I have to thank my wife, Rosa Luquin, for helping me to broker that, to negotiate that, to be present in a lot of these interviews, because without her help, I wouldn't have been able to do this work. This image is that I found in an archive at the Centro Regional de Educación Fundamental para Adultos de América Latina, which is a handful, CREFAL, sponsored by UNESCO in the 1950s, was taken in the community. This is a picture of my grandparents, my grandmother, my grandfather, one of my aunts, and this was a teacher that was in the community at that time in the 1950s. Of course, when we found the image, it was very surprising for the family, and it was important. One of the things that I noticed in this picture was how my grandmother was dressed in what is considered traditional purépecha dress, how my aunt was dressed a little different, my grandfather wearing overalls. I learned from this work that my grandfather was a bracero in the 1940s, that he spent some time working in the sugar beet fields in Colorado at that time. And ironically, some 60 years later, my first job as a professor was at the University of Colorado at Boulder. When I talked to my aunt about why she didn't dress the way my grandmother dressed, she explained to us that some of the teachers that went to the community also brought sewing machines. So part of their lesson was to learn how to make dresses. And the idea was that this type of dress was considered a more decent way of dressing than this type of dress. And so that's just to give you an example of how cultural change was influenced by outside institutions and forces in a community like this one, and why the effect of that, the long-term effect of that, was language loss and some loss of what people would consider to be traditional indigenous culture. Right? So these are some of the frameworks that I'm working with. Briefly, I'm not going to go into them. I'm looking at the effects of neoliberal policies in Mexico from the 1980s to the present, just to give some context, and what that involves: fiscal austerity, trade liberalization, especially through NAFTA, resource privatization, informal economies, that I'll talk a little bit about later, foreign investment, and extractivist policies, and regional recomposition. And by that I mean the ways in which the historic ways in which the land was being used, or the ways that people were making a living, has changed as a result of the impact of NAFTA and NAFTA-motivated policies, like the support for agro-export products. I also use Harvey's accumulation by dispossession method, which I will talk about in a bit also. Neoliberal multiculturalism, the state's minimal recognition of cultural and linguistic rights, especially for indigenous people, but with predetermined limits. Specifically, how Mexico recognized itself as a multicultural, multilingual state after the Zapatista rebellion, 1994, and with the Ley Cocopa of 2001. Studies of indigeneity in Latin America, especially studies of resurgent indigenous movements, but always keeping in mind that indigeneity is always contested and never singular, and it's particular to places, contexts, time, etc. And also cultural studies of identity and agency in relation to social movements, how identity functions as a semiotic mediator for agency, and how identity is always a dialogic process. So the economic conditions, there's always been a focus by the Mexican government on the agricultural practices of indigenous communities. Historically, it's been growing milpas, corn, beans, squash for subsistence. But the perception from the outside is that this form of agriculture needed to be developed, right? And for some, development is just another word for colonization. There was also been US intervention in this process, especially in the 1950s through the 70s with Green Revolution projects and the US Agency for International Development, which worked closely with the CREFAL, the organization that I mentioned earlier, in this area, so that Harvey Beatty in 1965, who was a professor at Montana State College, today Montana State University, said that it was a field laboratory in Mexico operated by Montana State, which encouraged the use of synthetic fertilizers that were not used in the area before, pesticides, which has led to soil erosion. For example, the contamination of Lake Pátzcuaro due to that soil erosion today is a very real issue. And then with NAFTA, foreign corn competition, which has displaced subsistence corn farming in this area, and which has led to people in this area having very few economic returns from growing corn, and also very few viable economic opportunities. After 1992, Mexico changed its constitution to privatize ejidos, which are communally owned lands, in order to make them private property and sellable to other people that are not from the community. And what this brought on in Michoacan was the intensified cultivation of avocado orchards. Today, Michoacan is the largest producer of avocados in Mexico, and the U.S. Imports about 80% of the U.S.'s avocado imports come from the state of Michoacan. So that this intensification of avocado production was called by the Wall Street Journal in 2012 the equivalent of blood diamonds in Africa. So it really has led to a very inequitable and exploitative conditions in the area. So these are some of the conditions. Land tenure has always been contested with indigenous communities, either through the haciendas and now through these mega corporations. I mentioned the Green Revolution projects. NAFTA after 1994 loosened restrictions on avocado imports in 1997 after an 80-year ban of avocado production. It also has intensified and encouraged us to consume more avocado, especially around the Super Bowl, so that we have been told continuously that avocado is good and that it's a healthy food, and the import of avocado has increased tremendously. So this push for more land has led to narco-cartel violence because the cartels are infiltrated in some of these agro-export companies, narco-trafficking, a series of narco-cartels, the Zetas in 2006, Familia Michoacana, 2010, Los Caballeros Templarios, currently a battle between Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación and La Nueva Familia Michoacana. So the context is rife with violence, intimidation, extortions, quotas, and the government has not helped, especially under Calderón's drug war, which has led to unprecedented deaths and disappearances. So there's less and less agriculture in ejido-based communities. And what that has led to is, as I mentioned, people looking for temporary low-paid jobs, either in construction. For the women, it's usually domestic work. And I want to make a connection between the movie Roma that a lot of people are talking about right now. So usually for indigenous women, that is usually their first source of wage labor. Also the autodefensas and cheranqueri and the decline in tourism. This area of Michoacan was historically a very heavy tourist area through Day of the Dead celebrations and through other very folklorized expressions of culture that were thought of as authentic Indian culture. But with all of this context of precarity, tourism has heavily declined. At the same time, there's been a resurgence of Purepecha culture, especially through the reinvention of traditions, right? For example, the bartering market the Moxtacuntan, the Purepecha New Year, Quinchicua, and the Purepecha Mass, which I talk about as hubs in another slide. So this is the oro verde. People refer to avocado as oro verde because of the amount of money that people are making from this product. And this is just an example of a US supermarket and how available they are. And I thought it was interesting that this brand is called Purepecha, right? So that the people become the product in a very commodified way. Click. So the town itself, Nocutzepo means lugar del valle in Purepecha. The town is pictured on maps from the 1538, 1539. I found various documents from the 16th through the 18th century referring to the people of Nocutzepo as indios and naturales, which were ways to refer to indigenous people. It never had the status of República de Indios, but it was considered a barrio, a subdependency of the cabecera, Pátzcuaro. It always had a contentious relationship with the local Hacienda Charagüen. During interviews with elders, there's a historical memory, community memory of having a Tarasco past. Tarasco is sort of the Spanish word for Purepecha. And it's a small community. In the 2010 census, it had a little bit over 900 people. But interestingly, between 1980 and the 2010 census, actually the 2000 census, the population was actually declining. And that was due primarily to outmigration, both to Mexico City and to the United States. In the last census, the population had actually grown. It has usos y costumbres. It was recognized as an indigenous community by the INI, the defunct Indigenous National Institute of Mexico. And so indigeneity has sort of been contested in this community. Although people don't readily identify as indigenous, there's all of this historical record that has positioned them in that way, or that gives them access to position themselves in this way. In terms of education, the Mexican education system has always looked at indigenous people as a problem, right? And one of the issues that they have grappled with is how to solve that problem. So education has always been seen as sort of a way to redeem indigenous people and to incorporate them into the national mainstream. So Mexico created its Ministry of Education in 1921, and Nocutzepo was one of the first places where a school was open. It was called Hogar y Patria. Indigeneity in a lot of the early reports of the school evaluations is sort of, again, contested. There's a report in 1927 that identifies the community as mestizo. Then there's a report from 1933 that I found in the National Archives that identifies it as Purepecha. And sort of there's these wavering identifications of the community. Also, I already mentioned the Crefal and their presence in the community. They added to the context of education in the community because the schools in Nocutzepo were shut down in the mid-1940s and then reopened due to lack of attendance. So attendance has always been an issue because the community depended heavily on agriculture, and a lot of children worked from early ages. And so school was not necessarily seen as a productive activity for a long time in the community. There's also been a lot of conflicts in the community over education. There was a conflict in the 1950s between a private Catholic school and then a public school, rural federal school. And then in the 1970s, there was another conflict over education as well that was very similar to the conflict that I'll be talking about today. In the 1970s, there was INI intervention. So the Indigenous Institute tried to open up a school that was indigenous-based, and that created a lot of conflict. And the way that it was resolved was that they opened up a new school in 1977, which is the Benito Juarez School. Although teachers have always been very respected in the community, there's always been tension with the education system, and usually it's been due to deficit views of the children and families, especially because There wasn't a trajectory of high academic achievement in the community, so a lot of times the teachers that came to serve in this community didn't really have high expectations or didn't think of the families as being involved in the ways that institutions sometimes want parents to be involved. They also had harsh discipline policies, including corporal punishment, that a lot of the parents were not happy about. So what this created was a very tense situation in the community, where the mothers especially were unhappy with a lot of the conditions at the school. So they started to demand better quality instruction. For one, they wanted a bathroom that was clean, that was safe, because they had a latrine, but a lot of the boards were rotting, and so a lot of the mothers feared that their children would just fall in. They wanted certified teachers, because a lot of the people that were in classrooms were not necessarily certified, or they were certified or they had permits to be custodians, but through family relations were allowed to take over classrooms. And they also wanted an end to verbal and physical and psychological, what they called verbal, physical, and psychological abuse. For example, Ana, a 35-year-old mother, shared with me, and I'll read the quotes in Spanish, you can read them in English. Usually the English translation is right below. En esta escuela llegaba un maestro tomado y las mamás le llamaban la atención a la directora, y esto en vez de decirle algo al maestro, mejor le daba las llaves para que se fuera a dormir a uno de los salones en lo que se recuperaba. Eso fue lo que hizo enojar a la gente. The teacher's intoxication incident was not isolated. Several parents commented that it became a regular occurrence, especially on Mondays. Another mother, Veronica, in her mid-30s, also added, a mi hija la ignoraba la maestra y no la dejaba ir al baño hasta que una vez se hizo ahí, y eso me dio mucho coraje porque mi hija llegó mojada y llorando porque los demás chiquillos se reían de ella. Veronica also mentioned that it wasn't the case that the children were not allowed to use the restroom because they were studying or learning a lesson, but because teachers were often chatting and ignoring their classes. During another interview, Eudelia, a younger mother in her late 20s, commented that she was trying not to get involved initially with the other organizing mothers because her daughter never had any problems and she always got good grades. But after hearing out another mother who was inviting her to an organizing meeting, she became worried that maybe it was true that the children were not being taught. When she got home, she handed her daughter her language arts textbook, and asked her to read aloud, but her daughter had great difficulty reading. It was then that Eudelia decided to join the mothers. Disappointed and upset, she asked, ¿Cómo es posible? Mi hija estaba para entrar en tercer grado y no sabía leer y tenía puros 9 y 10. ¿Cómo es posible que tenga esas calificaciones y no sepa leer? Rosario, an older woman who lived close to Benito Juárez, also shared, es verdad, yo lo vi. En el tiempo de frío, los maestros ponían a los niños a barrer todo el patio de la escuela y duraban horas mientras ellos se la pasaban platicando en el solecito calentándose. Los recreos también duraban horas y los niños hasta se aburrían de estar tanto tiempo afuera. The mother's words represent the persistent complaints they shared with teachers and administrators. A request for a bathroom instead of a latrine eventually built up a very tense situation within the school. The final event that erupted into a verbal confrontation between a group of mothers and the principal was when a male teacher allegedly yanked out a male student's earring, which caused the student to bleed. For weeks, the teacher had been verbally harassing the student and threatening to tear out the earring. When the boy came home with a bloody ear, his mother, Lilia, immediately went to the school with several of the members of the Mesa Directiva, which is sort of a PTA, and had a heated verbal exchange with the teacher and principal. The principal, Luvina, sided with the teacher, claiming that earrings were against the dress code. The student had been warned, and the action was justified. Lilia recalled the principal's abrupt response when the Mesa Directiva also chimed in about the other issues they were concerned about. Y ella nos contestó, ¿para qué quieren mejores maestros si al cabo de macuarros no van a salir? So again, this reflects the very deficit view that they had of the children. After this event, Lilia and several of the mothers were fed up, not only because they were defending their children, but also because many of them had also attended Benito Juárez and were taught by the same teachers. Several of the women had been Principal Luvina's students prior to her entering administration and remembered having their hair and ears pulled by her, as well as being knuckled in the head. By late spring of 2005, tension had escalated to the point that the mothers went beyond asking for an end to corporal punishment and verbal humiliation to demanding Luvina's resignation and the dismissal of teachers who they claimed failed to provide for their children an adequate education. So they took their requests higher up. An official in particular who was related to the school principal was angered by their persistent demands for meeting and was reported by Cecilia to respond, pues no voy a hacer más por otra gente que por mi propia sangre. So again, there was some nepotism in the ranks of the administration, and they were systematically ignored. In response to the abject humiliation they experienced, the mothers gathered during the summer vacation of 2005 and carefully planned a plantón, or a school takeover, that they executed on the eve of August 24th that impeded the start of the school year. They blocked off the entrance to the school with a bus that one of the fathers drove, and they hanged cloth banners that demanded the school principal's immediate resignation. Seeking out a larger public forum, they drove to Morelia, the state capital, and presented their demands along with 51 signatures in support to one of the largest newspapers in the state, La Jornada Michoacán, which is there. However, not all townspeople supported the mothers, especially because those that sided with Luvina and the teachers believed that the punishments were justified. Lilia San was no angel, according to Luz, an opposing mother, and there was no need to disrupt everyone's education because of a group of problematic women. Doña Sabina, a town elder, commented, if they were going to organize, then they should do it right. There was that young woman, that mocosa from the plain, yelling, what are they going to teach me? Upon seeing the disruption that the plantón caused, some of the women organized to open up the town library to allow the teachers to hold school there. The plantón did not generate the response that the mothers needed. Initially, there was no dialogue with the principal. They just were ignored. So the plantón lasted several months. And Maria recalled the events. El plantón duró más de un mes. Nos turnábamos para hacer guardia. Habíamos estacionado un autobús en la entrada para no dejar entrar a nadie. No dormíamos y nos mojábamos porque era tiempo de aguas. The school takeover ended when a counter group also met and decided to forcibly remove the mothers from the school. The mothers were physically brutalized and forcibly removed from the school compound by a mob consisting of school personnel, opposing community members, including men. Lalo remembered that day clearly. Estaba trabajando con mi compadre, Julio, aquí cerca, cuando de repente me dijo, ahorita vengo, compadre. Yo le veía nervioso, pero nunca me imaginé por qué. Se fue al ratito y empezaron a oír los gritos de las mujeres. Yo corrí a ver qué pasaba porque ahí estaba mi señora. Y ahí estaba él también, tumbando las carpas y empujando y jalando a las mujeres, junto con mucha gente más. Luz recalled how she tried to burn the mother's banners with a lighter, but could not because the banners were wet from the rain. Lilia also remembered the day vividly. Lilia is the mother of the child whose earring was torn out. Ahí nomás hubieras visto que se me deja venir el bip, maestro viejo, bip, el que le pegó a mi hijo. Y como ya nos traíamos ganas, que me da una cachetada, pero que se la regreso. Y luego lo agarré de las greñas y ya ni supe qué pasó. Cuando ya nos apartaron, traía un mechón de sus greñas en la mano llena de sangre. So and I use this example to show also that the mothers were not passive, right? They were not just victims. They also were fighting for what they believed. Even though the mothers were beaten and removed, their makeshift tents destroyed and protest banners torn down, they did not desist. One of the ways that they tried to deal with this was that they tried to enroll their kids in nearby schools. They also tried to open up their own school, but most of them had like a 6th grade education and did not have the economic means to run a school. So they kept looking for different options. The mothers also went on the defensive because they were also being portrayed as unrespectable women, especially because some of them had worked outside of the community in their youth. So there were rumors that some of them had worked in indecent activities, and so they were trying to maintain their respectability. So in their struggle for support, the mothers went to a local supervisor of the nearby Purépecha community of Arocutin. And one of the mothers commented, el director de Arocutin nos echó la mano, nos ofrecieron servicios de educación indígena usando la clave que ellos tienen. Ellos son Purépecha. And I want to alert you to the discourse, right? How they say they are Purépecha, right? So they make a distinction, because what I'm going to argue later is that they have to create sort of an alternative indigenous identity in order to make sense of why they don't speak Purépecha, right? And yet they're claiming to be indigenous. So this principle helped them out, and they created a satellite campus in the community with the other schools' enrollment. And so the teachers, when they first arrived, they were all Purépecha speakers, were not treated well by the people who opposed the school. A lot of them were jeered at when they came in or laughed at. So when I interviewed the principal, Samuel, he told me, hay gente que está en contra de Nueva Creación, the school, en esta comunidad, y nos acusan de imponer nuestra cultura con las familias y los niños. Nosotros no venimos a imponer nada. Este pueblo tiene usos y costumbres. Nosotros basamos nuestra pedagogía en usos y costumbres. Tal vez perdieron la lengua, pero sí tienen su cultura. So here he's acknowledging that they do have aspects of what he considers to be indigenous culture. I also wanted to get some of the perspectives of the fathers, because I get asked that question all the time, well, what about the fathers? And one of the fathers that I interviewed recalled how they built the school, because they didn't have any economic support to build the school. Nomás hubieras visto cómo estaba. No, ahora ya está más o menos. A mí sí me daba vergüenza, pero ya no podía echarme para atrás. El presidente municipal nos ayudó mucho. Él nos regaló las paredes de fierro de una clínica que tenían allá y fuimos a recogerlas. Era como basura, pero nos las trajimos y con ellas levantamos las paredes de la escuela. So this is what the school looked like in 2010. These are the metal sheet walls. This is a photo of some of the organizing meetings, because especially after they got their satellite campus, they tried to get their own school, autonomous from the school that was sponsoring them. This is some more of their organizing meetings, and this is the principal, Samuel. So curious, I returned in 2014, and I asked them if their notions of indigeneity had changed, how they perceive themselves, whether they perceive themselves as indigenous women or not, or how their self-definition had developed. And I conducted 21 interviews of the mothers in 2014, and I asked them to consider if they identified as indigenous or as mestiza. 19 identified as indigenous, 2 identified as mestiza. Probing further, I asked, what does indigena mean to you? Daniela responded, españoles no somos, creo que purépechas no somos porque no hablamos, pero indígenas por lo menos sí somos. So she's trying to make sense of that. Another mother, Maria, says, well, we are all Indians, no? We don't speak purépecha, but we are Indians. In Arocutin, Jaracua, Uricho, they speak Tarascan, but we are Indians. They're already teaching the children all of that in school, and they already know a few words. It's like as if we are indigenous now because they teach the children Tarascan in school. So again, these sense-making about themselves, right? This recreation of themselves as indigenous, but not necessarily purépecha. Another woman, Cruz, says, pues ser indígena es saber convivir, estar en la comunidad, participar en fiestas, en las faenas. Yo sé que no hablo bien purépecha bien, pero ¿quién me va a decir que no lo soy? Si conozco gente que sí habla purépecha y no quiere hacerlo porque le da vergüenza, les da vergüenza decir el nombre de su pueblo, ¿eso los hace ser más indígena que yo? No, no creo. Catalina says, ¿dónde pintas la raya entre ellos y nosotros? Ellos que hablan purépecha y nosotros que no. ¿Dónde, aparte del idioma, estamos tan cerca, estamos tan parecidos, hacemos las mismas cosas? La línea no existe, somos los mismos. So from a larger perspective for the mothers, rather than being absorbed and erased through the nationalist assimilationist practices of the liberal state, they developed a multi-layered discourse of indigeneity that allowed them to exist as indigenas and to enjoy some of the benefits of neoliberal multiculturalism, even without official sanction. particularly in education for the mothers and families involved in the struggle, and eventually they were conceded the school in 2012. On February 14th of 2012, which is in Purepecha, in the region, February 14th is the anniversary of the death of Tanashuan, who was the last Purepecha emperor. So it was significant even in that way. For the mothers and families involved in the struggle, it eventually meant finding for their children an alternative schooling and path to the few viable opportunities available to them in an agricultural community increasingly without agriculture, with a growing youth drug culture and local low-scale drug economy, and with few local paying jobs. An education through bilingual intercultural schooling would allow them access to coveted opportunities to higher education, including the local Teachers College, La Normal Indigena, an Indigenous Polytechnic Institute in Cheran, or the Indigenous Intercultural University, which is part of the Mexican Intercultural University system, with open enrollments and free tuition for Indigenous students. Agency through the Mothers' Resistance also became an important basis for alternative constructions of Indigena identity, because Purepecha identity still remained inaccessible to them due to language loss, and Mestiza was not Indian enough to merit intercultural bilingual schooling. The Mothers' Resurgent and perhaps maybe even generic Indigena identity, although controversial and maybe even problematic to traditional notions of Indigenous authenticity. By that I mean those notions of Indigenous authenticity policed by Native communities themselves, or even harmful to communities with stronger usos y costumbres, does however challenge the discourse of the incorporated or disappearing Indian by existing outside of the state-sanctioned definitions of indigeneity. Sobrevivencia, including strengthening communality and community control over institutions like schools, afforded the Nocutzepo mothers rights claims and opportunities like the school. The new school was named Curicaveri, like Curicaveri, as a step toward remedying generational educational neglect and by providing another educational outlet for their children. Most importantly, the Curicaveri bilingual intercultural community, strengthened by a sense of collective struggle, played an important role in rekindling comunalidad as a basis for indigeneity for the mothers and their children. This space of comunalidad focused on alternative co-labor, faena or tequio in some other parts of Mexico, to build and support the school with local community knowledge as a basis for learning and community memory as a basis for Indigena resurgence. Despite the noteworthy accomplishments of the mother's struggle, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip some of this. I was going to show you some of the hubs and what I'm calling native hubs, drawing from Reina Ramirez, that they now participate in, where there's this rekindling of identity and a feeling of belonging to a larger Purepecha nation. Purecherio is fomented. The bartering market, the Purepecha Mass, because Catholicism is very heavily entrenched in Purepecha culture, is all part of this. So what are some of the implications? As I mentioned, they challenge this idea that they challenge the state structural definitions of who's indigenous. They upset the Indian, non-Indian dichotomy, or this idea of authentic versus non-authentic indigenous person. They also challenged romantic discourses of disappearing Indian or authentic Indian, because we expect to see certain images when we think of indigenous people. It also shows that the mothers valued education, which contradicts a lot of the narratives about indigenous women, about indigenous rural communities. Indigenous women were not passive, they were not victims. They also took control of local institutions to remedy generational neglect in ways that men did not, and I think that that's noteworthy. And also how they focused on co-labor or faena, or the relational relationships between them to support and maintain the school in ways that highlight indigeneity different than the usual aesthetic ways that we think of indigenous people. Last, I entertain some questions here that I don't have time for. I don't want to romanticize the mother struggle, so I want to end with some questions. How did the eventual concession of the school by local authorities divert attention away from larger struggles of oppression? How did the concession of the official school in 2012 minimize the potential for larger unified struggles against neoliberal dislocations, especially since the Nocutzepo mothers had already joined the struggle with neighboring pueblos that were also demanding better education for their children? How did the victory that Curicaveri represented to the mothers also fix discourses, identities, and people into regimes of governance? Because then they're under the governance of the state again, right? Going back to the metal sheet walls, they were destroyed in 2015 by a strong whirlwind. Here's a picture of that event. Again, the precarity that the school existed in. even when they were already authorized as a school. However, again, the struggle of the mothers, of the fathers, all pitched in to rebuild the school, and this is what the school looked like in January of 2019. And I'm going to end there because we need time for questions. So.
Just invite you, we know that some of you will have to leave in a few minutes for a class, but if you have a question, please come to the microphone. Tell us your name and your major, a little about yourself. So, because this is being filmed, we'll get both your question and Dr. Urrieta's response on to your question. And as I said, some of you may have to leave. That's fine. Please do so quietly, but we'll continue till about the top of the hour, 1 o'clock. Please.
Hi, my name is Jessica Mitten. Is this on? Nope. Okay, well. I'll just talk really loud. So at the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned your worry about having been born in the US and how that might affect things or whatever. I was wondering, when you were actually doing your research in Mexico, if your background affected how the indigenous people you worked with responded to you.
Yeah, I have no doubt that it affected their responses in good and bad ways. I think some people, just by the fact that I was from town, had certain expectations of me and what I was supposed to either add or contribute to what they were doing. And also due to the power differentials, were sometimes accommodating to my request for interviews or for documents or for, just time with me, even though they all had work to do and things like that. On the opposite end, I think that for some people, I was coming into this community with a whole generational history. I mean, people knew my parents, they knew my grandparents, and a lot of times, although we homogenize indigenous communities as being fairly equal, there are inequities in these communities, and those inequities in the past have led to conflicts. Especially, I mentioned conflicts in the 1950s, conflicts in the 1970s, where people already had ideas about me and what I would be like without even knowing me, which sometimes, led to their refusal to cooperate or collaborate with me or to talk to me. And I remember there was a meeting once where, there were a lot of men talking and, everybody wanted sort of to talk. And then in these meetings, they draw out sometimes late into the night and everybody wants to say something. And I wanted to get in a couple of words myself, and somebody said, dejen a Luisito hablar, let Luisito, they call me Luisito because my dad is Luis too. Let Luisito speak, he's a teacher, let him talk. And then somebody else turned around and said, I don't care if Luisito's a teacher, he's a person just like the rest of us, he can talk when his turn comes. So it was that, right, just a negotiation of that constantly. And actually, by the time we left, because people positioned me as siding with this school as opposed to Benito Juarez, it was already leading to a very tense situation for us in the community, because I couldn't any longer navigate between the two spheres without being associated more exclusively with the Curicaveri school and that group of parents. So that's a great question, though. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hannah. Sorry, it just disappeared. So in what ways has education improved, and what barriers do you still see existing?
I think if you ask most people in the community, they would say that the education has improved merely because there are two schools now and they're both competing for students. So the enrollment waivers at each one of them, depending on how the schools go out there and recruit, which also places that competition within a sort of like a larger neoliberal landscape of choice, right? The schools have competed, to take students to regional contests, academic contests, to show higher results in state exams. So in that sense, I think they would say that the school has improved. In the cultural sense, Benito Juarez has incorporated more of the local indigenous culture into their instruction. They have incorporated more of the folkloric dances. They want to start teaching Purépecha lessons to the kids. But in general, I mean, the state of Michoacán is one of the states that lags the most than any other state. It's not at the bottom, but it certainly is at the lower end in terms of educational resources, budgets, educational outcomes than the rest of the country. Despite that it has a multi-billion-dollar avocado industry that's booming and growing ever more. So that's kind of where things are, right?
Thank you.
Hi there, my name's Andrew. You mentioned kind of in that one of the descriptions about the autodefensas groups, and I was wondering, do those groups, kind of self-defense groups, ever fall along indigenous lines, or do indigenous people ever kind of feel like a need for kind of armed conflict in terms of reclamation or defending kind of their people?
Well, the way that it worked out in Cherán in 2011 was that it was largely community members that expelled all the political parties. They expelled the people who were doing the illegal lumbering, anybody suspected of being involved with the cartels, and they strongly identify as Purépecha. So in that case, I would say that it was strongly indigenous-based, but in other communities, even though they put out a rhetoric of being indigenous, they ended up being involved also with the cartels. And they ended up being part of those networks as well. So it really depends on each community, right? The state recognized autodefensas as local police forces. And so what that did is it gave them more power, right? But whether they are indigenous of that particular community, whether that is a salient identity, it really depends on each community. In the Tancítaro area, it's mostly based on protecting the business interests of the avocado producers, right? So there, it's more of almost like a hired, police force, right,
Yeah.
to protect their interests. So you have to look at each one of them in their own local context, right? But the larger discourse was that it was autonomous indigenous groups protecting the communities themselves from the incursion of the narco carteles, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Emery. I was wondering, these indigenous women that took over the school, were they defying traditional female roles that existed for them, or were those roles already in existence within the indigenous community?
Well, there's several sort of images that have been perpetuated about indigenous women. I think one that's perpetuated from the outside is that they're passive and that they're oppressed by men and that they fulfill very traditional roles. I would say that indigenous women in most communities are very active. They've been involved in a lot of struggles that they enjoy because gender roles are very divided and gender spaces are very divided in a lot of these communities, that they've enjoyed independence and autonomy within those spaces, especially when they travel to outside markets, when they do all kinds of things that we don't usually associate with them. But in terms of organizing an indigenous women's movements, there's a long history of indigenous women resisting and fighting back. I mean, from the time that the Spanish arrived, right, to the way that they resisted in Tlatelolco when the Spanish, got there. I mean, indigenous women have always been, in some ways, at the forefront, even with their very bodies, to protect their communities, their children, and their larger interests. So I wouldn't say that it was necessarily an anomaly, because even the struggle of the 1970s was largely led by women also. So, yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
My name is Elijah Bickmore, and I'm a Middle East Studies major. In your opinion, on a national or a large governmental level, is it possible to create more culturally aware or culturally flexible educational system where that addresses the perceived tension between indigenous identity and indigenous culture and educational development and the need for improving education systems in a lot of those areas.
The Mexican education system is very centralized.
Mhm.
The curriculum is standardized for the whole nation. Each state has its own history text for state history. And in the intercultural schooling model, one of the big differences is that they incorporate indigenous language instruction, whatever the local indigenous language is. But it's not necessarily the basis of the instruction, like the larger academic instruction. Like they don't teach math in Purepecha or they don't teach history in Purepecha. It becomes a subject. So I think that indigenous communities have to be looked at in their local context, in local cultures. So one way to address this question that you're asking would be to have some more local autonomy of the curriculum, some more local autonomy of the way that the schools run, of who the teachers are and how much they can relate and be part of the community itself. A lot of the ways that we think about education here, right? Culturally relevant curriculum, using the local community knowledge as the basis of instruction, incorporating the local language as the language of instruction. But that would require a larger decentralization of the educational system itself, right?
Yeah. That being said, how do you balance the need for that more like localization or decentralization of the educational system with the need to maintain standards of quality and quality for education? Yeah.
I think it really asks us to question what we mean by quality. And what those standards of quality are and how they're measured. A lot of times they use external measures or externally created measures or standards and then impose them on communities. My approach would be, what would those standards and approaches look like if they were generated by the community itself, right? And then how could we put those in dialogue or in conjunction with the larger standards that are imposed from outside? So for example, the PISA is one of those international tests or measures that's used to look at Mexican students' achievement. But it's one that's used worldwide, right? So, and then the new requirements, the new testing metrics that are being incorporated into Mexican education are also created from the top and then imposed on communities. So what would those look like if the communities themselves generated them? If the communities themselves had input in their creation or in the curriculum itself? What would a curriculum from scratch look like in each community? And then how could we translate or bridge that curriculum to the larger standards or to the external standards in a way that makes sense? Because right now they're so foreign that a lot of times I don't think that they make sense, right? We're imposing a knowledge system on a different knowledge system. And then we're trying to measure that, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, so you discussed in your presentation how these women had to worry about their respectability within the community, how there were rumors going around about them leaving the community and what work they had been involved in with that. I was wondering if you could more clearly define the difference in the gender roles of the community. You talked very little about male involvement in the conflict and its resolution, and I was wondering why there wasn't more male intervention, and then how, and I realize this is kind of subjective, but how you think the conflict might have played out differently if there had been more male intervention.
In terms of gender roles, this idea of working outside of the community as a single woman, even though women have liberty to come and go in the community, they usually acquire that more of that liberty once they're married. So to leave the community as a single woman and to be away from family and to work has always sort of raised eyebrows. And so in terms of their respectability, when the type of work that they had been involved in was questioned, I think it really was trying to discredit what they were doing, right? Which I associate in other work with mothering, right? A form of public mothering, right? Their work in trying to improve the education of their children and the larger community in general as a form of public mothering, which is an acceptable form of gender, performance, right? The lack of male intervention, I think, has to do with the ways in which men tried to maintain their relations with each other despite the conflict. So Lalo still was working with his compadres side by side, even though they were on different sides. With the women, when you were on a different side, there was a rupture. Like the communication split off because they were more intensely involved. The men were involved with some of the physical labor, like the actual construction of the sites, transporting women. When I've interviewed men more recently, I've asked them, because I always get asked this question, why weren't you more involved? And they always say, well, because we had to work. And I said, well, are you saying that the women didn't have to work? Well, they didn't have to bring money home. So that's some of the ways that they've justified them not being involved. But I have a feeling, my intuition is that they always try to maintain male-male relations in a more harmonious way, a more detached way, and sort of framed the conflict as more of a woman's sort of issue, right? More of a woman's sort of conflict, not necessarily their conflict. But obviously it was their conflict too, right? Because once their women were being brutalized, they also were involved too. So there's all these under layers, right, of how gender played out. But it's complicated, and it still is complicated because there are still two schools, right? The conflict either surfaces or is downplayed depending on what the larger political context of the town is. Because around election times, people that side with one school sort of align with one political party, and the ones that side with the other school align with the other opposing political party. So some of those relations are also tied to politics. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I have a question about the curriculums in the different schools. When you talked about they trying to establish their own schools as to solve the problems that they're facing, what would you say would be some of the primary or fundamental differences in the curriculums for the schools that were already there compared to the ones that the indigenous people were wanting to start, or the indigenous focused schools were about?
There really isn't a big difference, because as I mentioned, the Mexican education system is very highly centralized. So there are textbooks that are national textbooks that are the ones that are distributed to the schools. It's so centralized that the Mexican education system created what they call telesecundarias, where they deliver lessons via TV, by satellite, where somebody in Mexico City could be teaching a math lesson, and it's being watched throughout the country. And that's to allow people to have more access to education, because those telesecundarias only require 1 or 2 teachers for 3 grades, several groups of 3 grades. And the instruction is on TV. The teacher's just there to sort of explain things. So with the intercultural model, the biggest difference is that they incorporate indigenous language instruction. So Purepecha language instruction as a separate course. And also the incorporation of the local culture in public events, like Dia de los Muertos. The kids would take time off from their instruction to learn about Dia de los Muertos, to create a traditional tomb, and then to reenact what Dia de los Muertos is, right? For the Año Nuevo Purepecha, they would have a parade, right, where they parade through the town with the Purepecha flag, with the Purepecha symbols. They would light the new fire. It would be distributed. And then there would be a big convivencia, right, with food and drinks and all that. That's also part of the curriculum, but it's not necessarily the official curriculum. I would say that in those ways, that convivencia, that communality, is the largest way in which these schools are different than the regular, rural schools. That recognition of the local culture, that reenactment of the local traditions, a redefinition of certain events like February 14th stops being Dia del Amor y de la Amistad or Valentine's Day and becomes the day that Tanashuan was murdered, right? March 21st, which in the regular school is called El Día de la Primavera. In the indigenous school is Benito Juárez's birthday, because he is the first and only indigenous president of Mexico. So there is some redefining and reinterpreting, but in terms of the actual curriculum itself, it's very rigid and very standard.
Thank you.
Can you join me once again in thanking Dr.
Thank you.